Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah. Bismillah walhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Last week we talked about dua and writing du'as. Remember? I think all of you were here last week. Thank you for making it out even on a long weekend. There's no classes in session. Did anybody actually go through that exercise when we got home to write out your du'as or to spend some more time in writing your du'as? Did it? How did it go?
I like a journal, so I mention all of these as well. So it was like an everyday thing for me.
Okay. How does that work out for you?
It really helps me to calm down because it really helps me get a little clarity because I think a lot. So when I write stuff down, sort of, clarity, and also I know what to ask for because when I keep forgetting what I need to ask for.
So, did anybody else try? Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote it down on like a little sticky note, but I think like sometimes I feel like so overwhelmed with my thoughts, my busy schedule. So it helps to like organize like what I want and like be aware of certain things. I have questions about like what do I make dua for? Like how do I phrase my duas?
What were the answers you came up with?
Duas about like studying, all these things. Like how do I phrase them? What do I ask for?
And are you answering that question to yourself, Trevor? Yeah. Yeah, great. Okay. Anyone else? So what I wanted us to talk about today, building off of last week's discussion, and maybe I'll actually utilize the chalkboard, I'm not sure, is to understand now fundamentally what the purpose is behind some of these things, right? You make dua. What's the point of making dua, for example? Why do we do it? Why do we do it? Why do you make dua? Why do you pray or why do you fast? What's like a fundamental component to all of these things? What's the point of it? Yeah.
I feel like I want something.
Sure. And that can be a part of it. But say we change the ritual and it wasn't dua, it was like charity or fasting, etc. Right? Like why? What's the thing that links all of these things together? Yeah, okay. Let me reframe it. When you think about ritual, it's an act. And so the engagement of the act in and of itself has constancy to it, right? You can change your dua in terms of the phrasing of things, the language, what you're asking for. You can change the time of the day, but pretty much it's the same. When you're praying your prayers, they're pretty much the same, right? The mechanics, the form, you can tweak it a little bit in terms of what part of the Quran are you reading, what du'as do you make in the course of your prayer, in different portions and positions of the prayer. The fasting is pretty much the same. You're fasting. You could do it at different times of the year. And in an equation of ritual, what you're going to find essentially is that there's formulas that you can adopt to help also deepen in a relationship with practice. Sorry, I didn't think I was going to use this. I also didn't think I was going to show up today. I'm not saying I'm not happy to see you all. But I thought I was going to go home. So if we have, for example, this vehicle, you can call it dua, you can call it your salah, you can be your fasting, your charity, whatever it is. And this is you, right? That's me. And what it's connecting me to is God. It's connecting me to Allah. So if these things here have constancy too, they're not necessarily in flux, right? It's the same 2 rak'ahs as you're praying in Fajr all the time. It's 2 sunnahs, 2 fard, whatever. You're fasting in Ramadan, it's pretty much the same, right? The mechanics don't change as such, right? And Allah is Ghani, right? Of the many divine names that he tells us of himself, he is self-sufficient, right? So all of us, we exist in a state that's distinct, right? We're called Abd, right? We're Abd. And you're an Abd because you rely on something. You're not self-sufficient. So everything in existence is an Abd because it's not self-sustaining. And then you can narrow that down to being an Abd of God, right? Abdullah, Abdurrahman, because you are now saying that my reliance, I will particularly consciously put onto the divine. But Allah is not an Abd of anything, right? Allah is Ghani, he's self-sufficient, meaning God doesn't change. And so if this doesn't change, and the one that you are engaging through the ritual also is not transformed, the fundamental purpose of all of this is that it's supposed to bring transformation here, right? Because when you're making dua, God is not a birthday cake that you're blowing out a candle and making a wish, right? It's not a genie in a lamp type situation. You know what I mean? The subservience now goes in this direction. And so the nature of this is that it's meant to be transformative of the one who is engaging in it. You see what I mean? Does that make sense? And it's an important part of self-reflection because when you have a religion that is rooted in ritual, it can now become something of a challenge because the ritual can be seen as an ends rather than a means to something, right? And then it can become overtly ritualized. So the mechanics are important. They're not something, though, that are absolute in terms of what is the gain or kind of the movement forward, but they're supposed to be bringing you to something at the end of the day, right? And the status and nature of this and the one that you are praying to means that the only thing that you really control in all of this is the presence of yourself. If there's not awareness of the you that you're bringing to this, it might not necessarily be, well, why is the dua not effective? Or why is my prayer just feeling mechanical? But you got to hone in on, well, what's going on here and what's everything that I'm bringing to it? Does that make sense? What do you think? Why are you nodding your head?
Yeah, it does make sense.
Okay, what does it make you think about? Anything?
What you just said,
Yeah, what else is that?
I mean, it makes sense now because you do this all to like A, connect with God and become like a better version of ourselves. So I'm making dua that I'm like making dua for my character, and I have good character, then making dua that I pass my exams and increase my knowledge, give me the grade. So become like a better version of myself while it's connected to God.
Yeah, it's transformational of you, but there's a circularity to it, right? That in order for it to be transformational of me, I also have to know who I am when I'm coming to it. You see what I mean? So if you're coming to your prayer, your fasting, your charity, and you're in a space of just exhaustion, you're in a space of just stress, or you're in a place where you're just building in distraction, right? A good friend of mine was staying over my place. He's really into basketball. NBA finals are going on. Time to pray. And he said, okay. And in my apartment, which I'm hoping, inshallah, many of you will be able to come to again soon for dinner and things, which we normally do. If you come to my apartment, you'll see that where we have the TV in our living room, that's also kind of the direction of the Qibla. My friend was over and I said, let's pray, the time's finishing. And he just muted the television and it's still on. So it's like you're praying to the TV screen and you can see Kyrie Irving still on TV, Kevin Durant still on TV. I'm like, hey man, you gotta turn the TV off. So he turned it off. But fundamentally, the state of his prayer is going to be rooted in also the person that he's bringing to it, right? So like hadith that tell us things such as there's no prayer when food is served. Doesn't mean that you don't pray, but you've already created the distraction that's going to take away attentiveness, right? Don't pray like a rooster. The prophet says like pecking at the ground. So you're just going at it in a space where you're just running through it, rapid fire. You're in a state of agitation. You have an argument with a loved one. You're in a space where things are not necessarily feeling so good with somebody. All of those things are going to still catch up to you. I think in the coming weeks, what we'll start to do is look at now a specific set of topics attached to a structured discussion. I want to look at the first 10 verses of Surah Al-Mu'minun because they have characteristics that I think can allow for us to delve deep. Or we'll look at one of two books that I had mentioned in the beginning of our halaqah. But as a point of where we're at right now, some of the things that we can engage in to help us, right? Like if you're praying and you want to know where you're at in the course of your prayer, we have a concept that you'll see in Surah Al-Mu'minun that's called khushu'. Khushu' is concentration, humility, etc. There's focus, right? And the idea isn't to just pretend like the world doesn't exist. Because when you learn to be the imam, you learn to listen. If you make a mistake in your prayer, you learn to listen to someone correcting your prayer because they're going to say subhanallah if you made a mistake. So if focus is about not being able to hear anything, well, how are you going to hear the guy correcting you if you make a mistake if you're not able to hear anything? Right? Or we're taught that the Prophet ﷺ, he would shorten the prayer if he heard a child crying, so as to not distress the mother, right? He's sent as a mercy to the world. How can he do that if he's not able to hear that the baby is crying, right? That's not what focus is. Focus, though, and concentration is something that we'll talk about a little bit more in detail in the coming weeks. But I want you to think about when you're standing to pray, the thoughts that come into your head, those are usually not unimportant things. And quite often they're telling now about, well, where's really my mind at? What are the things that are agitating my inside? It's not always just, oh, you know, this carpet has such a nice design to it. Or I wonder what that crumb is over there. Or there's a bug that's walking across the entire room. But in your head, now when there's supposed to be stillness or the adoption of concentration and focus, the restlessness that comes up is giving a good indication as to what's really preoccupying the mind, right? So you're trying to be in a state now where the attentiveness is there and the heart is at rest, but the heart can't be at rest if there's something that's causing it to go in all different directions. You get what I'm saying? I want you to take a minute now, just in your notebooks, whatever, like we said last week, you have things to write in. I want you to think, what gets in the way? Like, what is it that starts to now take hold of my thoughts? What are things that come up that are making the self that I'm bringing to these practices? It kind of disrupts it. It creates that unease. What's pulling at me so that it's hard for me to sit and even make some kind of dua, right? What's immediately in my head when I'm in this place? And that can be situational too. It's not easy, right? You can walk to class and you got 10 minutes now between two classes and Maghrib is coming down and you're finding an empty classroom and you're wondering who's going to walk in on me while I'm praying. It's not easy, it's disruptive. So don't think about it as a good or a bad thing, right? These are things that are difficult. It's very easy for people who have a certain amount of privilege, right? Like I literally work down the hall, and down the hall from me is a prayer room. You don't have a traveling prayer room. So you don't want to think in a mode of self-deprecation, but you think in the course of your day, when you're trying to figure out how to now make this transformational so that I have presence in these things, right? I made wudu and Kimmel, and I was literally had my foot in the sink, washing it. You're all a Muslim, you know, right? And the lady walks into the bathroom and she's staring at me with my foot in the sink. And I think one, she was confused because like, who's this man in this bathroom? And two, why's he got his foot in the sink? Right? That was just where she was at. It's hard to concentrate in moments when you're wondering, is somebody going to come in, come out? That's just an example, right? What are other things that come up? You know, like if I'm not doing so well, my wife and I are arguing. You know, we just had an argument. I'm going to stand to pray Dhuhr. Or she and I haven't talked to each other for a couple of days because I said something dumb to her, right? Those things are going to pop up here. And some have continuity to them, right? Some are things that have happened to us over time. Some are different types of anxieties and agitations. I want you to just take 3-4 minutes. What are the kind of things that come up in your presence when you're engaged in some of these practices, right? Where do your thoughts wander to? What's catching your thoughts, taking away from your attention? Does it make sense? And then we'll come back and we'll discuss some of that. How's that going? Are there things coming up? Like, you don't have to tell me what those things are, but how does it feel to think about what those things might be? Is it easy? Is it difficult? Yeah.
I feel like it's a bit difficult for me because it's so situational. Like it's very much dependent on like what problem I have at the time since I'm a pretty big overthinker. So usually it's very hard, like I can it's very hard for me to focus like when I try to pray or do these things because there's always like things running in my head and it's really dependent on like just what happened like simply like 30 seconds ago or like 5 minutes ago.
Yeah. So it's tough, right? So to be reasonable with oneself and to understand now that, like we talked about in one of the first weeks, you're made up of a lot of different components. And the frames that we want to understand some of this in is now also, hey, it's hard because different circumstances will yield different things. So maybe the starting point isn't what agitates me, but the starting point is what creates rest within me. Where do I find stillness? Where do I find relaxation? Right? I had a young woman who came to see me who is a survivor of abuse, right? And Allah make things easy for her and for all those who find themselves in these places. And she and I spent a lot of time talking about different things for her own healing in relation to faith and God. And as she was moving forward, she came to a halt because she found out that the person who had assaulted her had now also assaulted somebody else that she knew. She's sitting in my office again. She says, I don't feel anything in the course of my prayer. And I feel like everything is just broken inside of me. And so we started to talk about this now. And I said, tell me, where do you feel like light? Where do you feel more at rest? She said, I really enjoy running. I said, what does it feel like when you run? And she says, when I go and run, I feel like all of the stress just leaves me. And all the heaviness is just gone, and everything inside just feels very free and liberated. I said, did you ever try praying after you run? And she said, no. Like, do we do that? Do people do that? And I said, you're not people, you're a person. And you need to have a sense of self-awareness and self-consciousness. So next time you go and you run, try to make some dua. Try to pray a couple of rak'ah. And I saw her a few weeks later and I asked her, how are things going? And she said she went to the track and she ran. And after she ran, she prayed. She said, I haven't prayed like that in so long. And she didn't need to pray like that every single prayer, but she needed to know that it was something that was still possible, that what had happened to her hadn't taken that away from her. Do you understand? And so those spaces of stillness become important because sometimes when you do one of these things, you're just going to have to do it because it's an obligation. It's not about the feeling necessarily. It's the fulfillment of the fard. So you pray Dhuhr at the time Dhuhr comes in because you're not worshiping a feeling. You're worshiping a God who told you to pray at this time. I have a son and a daughter who I love very much. My 6-year-old Kareem, my 8-year-old Medina. And my son wakes up super early and has been doing that since he was like 3 years old. And so when he's awake and he's just bouncing up and down all the time, jumping, cannot stand still for more than 10, 15 seconds at most. He's grabbing my legs, he's pulling on my clothes, he's jumping on my back. That's what Fajr is like in my house. You could be the most focused, attentive human being in the world. When some kid is literally slapping your butt over and over while you're praying, you are going to have disruption to your focus. I could turn to my kid and I could say all kinds of things in anger, or I could recognize that he's a child and he's just being a child. So at that time of Fajr, I'm fulfilling what Fajr requires of me, but maybe I need to seek stillness at a different time of the day. Does that make sense? And so there's going to be some times when you are out there and the institution you're in is not a space that is teaching you, by the way, go take 5 minutes for your own contemplation. Why don't you go take 10 minutes to wash up and pray? Or why don't you sit and make some dua or things like this? So you just try your best. But part of trying your best is also recognizing, how do I then create the opportunities for me to also have stillness, to be in a place where I know what agitates my mind and my heart. So what creates now a release of those things? So if not on a daily basis, every few days, perhaps a couple of times a week, I'm in a place where I can let the heaviness just diminish and I can be super present. Sayyid ibn Musayyib, rahimullah, who is a great scholar of our tradition, he used to say that I could tell when my dua was being accepted, because the goosebumps would just riddle my arms and the tears would be dropping from my eyes, but I also just didn't want to stop praying. I just wanted to keep praying and keep praying and keep praying. It's hard to do that when you have 10 minutes in between classes, or you're stuck in a place and you're trying to find a dressing room to pray in because you don't know how to do that in the streets of Manhattan. It's not a competition between you and anyone. It's just the you are today being able to reach the potential you that you can be tomorrow. But to bring a sense of awareness to it that says, well, here's where I know where it's tough. And here's the circumstances that I know that are going to make it hard. And so all I can do is pray those 2 rakahs. I was at Tandon giving the khutbah, and the first week I was there, they said, you got to end well before 2 so people can go to class. Now I gave it again a month later, and they said, you cannot end until people whose class finishes at 1:55 can make it here. I said, how in the hell you want me to both end before 2 and not end before people who are leaving other buildings at 1:55 are going to get here? They're like, oh, no. But that's where there's mercy in our tradition, that for some people, Jummah is just going to be that they catch the end of that last rak'ah. When we were open to everybody, the guys who sell you chicken and rice come to pray here. Those guys can't jump out of their cart for an hour and a half to come and sit in Jummah. They got a few minutes to run in and catch what is the minimum, but for them, it's the most that they can do. And so you start to build that sense of self into your routine. So I want you to take a few minutes now and just think for yourself, not just about spaces or people, but circumstances, entire environments, to take into consideration that you also have an aql, you have a qalb, you have a jasad, you have a ruh, you have a nafs, you have irada. What is like a space or a place that you can be in that creates that sense of rest and relaxation for you, right? Just like this woman that I told you, she knew of herself that when she runs, it causes the agitation to release. And when she said to me, do people do that? And I said, we're not people, you're a person. You have an individual heart that's precious. You're not creating worship, right? We talked about this hadith 3 weeks ago, that the Prophet ﷺ says the entire earth is a masjid, right? So she's just picking a different place to pray, but she's bringing now more of her own presence to it. You see what I mean? So what's that circumstance for you in the ideal sense of it? Spaces, environments, individuals. What's the situation where you find rest in that you can then also add on to it a few minutes of dua or a couple of rak'ahs of prayer. Does that make sense? It doesn't have to be complex. It could be as simple as, I love coming to Hana's art class, and I like sitting with people and drawing and just being away from everything else and letting the moments where I'm sharing and laughter and also just calmness. Maybe that's a time after which I sit, and if I make dua for a minute or two, because I feel a little bit more open than restricted inwardly. You see what I mean? If you take a few minutes now, you can think about that. Again, if you could write it to yourself. What are like these spaces, these situations, these environments that allow for there to be ease, that allow for there to be that kind of rest inwardly? And we'll come back and discuss for a bit. What are some of the things that are coming up? Like if I'm trying to now be in more control of the self that I'm bringing here, what are some of the kind of categories of things that I can have control over that ensure that in the midst of all of that restlessness and agitation, I'm still finding some semblance of real connection? You see what I mean? Yeah.
I mean, at least for me, it's my surroundings.
Okay. Can
Well,
you describe that a little bit more?
yeah. So for example, when I'm on campus, I'm always thinking about assignments, work, midterms, whatever. And it's hard to really get focused on one thing. But if I go like out by the piers or out to a park where there's like less going on around me, then it's easier to, or like an area where you're by yourself, it's easier to focus on what you're thinking on instead of just around.
Great. Surroundings. What else? Yeah.
The people that I'm with. So for me, like I like recently like had to like make the decision, take some space from a friend of mine because I realized like it took up a lot of my like I guess my mind, like the space in my mind because it was just very like consuming. And so like I can at least control like the friends that I like work with or spend time with, that like I can prioritize myself without feeling so like responsible for someone.
Okay, and these are like different people. They can be friends, you said, or coworkers, etc. What else? Yeah.
I wake up early, then I have time to do stuff around the house, like cooking. And so once I do that, I do very calm, and then I have
Okay.
I really don't care.
Time management. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I usually put myself in a different mindset than when I'm studying. So like I try to go on long runs to just zone out.
Okay. Physical wellness. Because there's a physical component to this, right? Like you're not gonna be able to stand in the late hour of the night to pray if your body is in a state of just kind of agitation, like the physical body. It's gonna be hard to get up at sunrise when your body's also exhausted, right? Anything else? So when you're applying this now to these various things, how much of this actually gets put into like my daily prayers, my dua, etc.? Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? Like, is there a lot of room to add this kind of consideration here? We're talking about a 24-day period and 7 days a week. And in the course of that, where do you have room? And if the answer is I don't have room, like you're kidding, you're lying to yourself, right? Because I'm much busier than all of you are. I can say with super comfort. And I still make time to have some spaces for myself in these groupings as well as other things that are not mentioned here, right? So bringing this deliberately into your routine and into your planning, and then just adding to it, because some of it is probably things that pre-exist. You know, you take long runs, add some dua to that time, right? Sit for a little bit. You're like sweating and breathing heavy. You're literally letting out all of this from your body. You just take a moment to allow for yourself to be in a space where you're comfortable in prayer, right? Some of the other things that are going to come into this are going to be things also like consumption. Noise can be a factor, right? Like the rest of your sensory perception, you know what I mean? But you want to be in a space where you start to like have strategy around this. Because otherwise, as you get older, it's going to be easier to just say, well, all of these things just have to happen. Right? The whole point is that when you're 6 or 7 or 10 or 15, you learn the mechanics, but then you've learned them and you move past them. But now you figure out how to adapt them. You know how to make wudu at this point, right? Now you got to figure out, how do I make wudu a spiritually meaningful act? You see what I mean? So if the crux of my day is spent in spaces where it's hard for me to be in that state, then I still am making time to build into my routine on a regular basis things that I don't have to then worry about those other stresses. You see? And that can be also attached to not just things that are purely ritualistic in their form, but also things that are like charity, for example, volunteerism, right? Because the people that you hang out with and your time management and all these things are going to play a role in determining hey, should I go visit sick people in the hospital? Should I go spend some time at the soup kitchen? Or am I just going to be in a space where that's not the norm elsewhere, and I'm going to continue to just follow what is deemed to be normative by others? Does that make sense? And then your prayer is going to be like the rooster pecking at the ground, because you're going to roll out of bed, you're going to just throw yourself up and down on the floor, then you're just going to get back into bed, right? Anything else that we want to add to this? Great. So what I'd like you to do between this week and next is just spend some time in assessment, right? In the course of your week, how much are you in a space that allows for rest versus a space that allows for agitation? And what are you doing to build deliberate moments of rest and relaxation into the course of your day, into the course of your routine? It could be about getting away from people, right? I love my kids. I love my wife. I love them so much. I love also waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning and going to the gym by myself and just being there, and there's no other noise around it. I really like it. But it helps me to love the time I have with them that much more, because I'm crafting now into my routine something that allows for me to still have that space of quietness to me. I don't have to disrupt like my running or my exercising to time limits that are not what I'd like for them to be, right? Or at the end of the day, when I'm done with this halakha and everything else is done, I'm going to choose to walk home as opposed to getting on a bus or getting into a car or a taxi. And I'm going to choose to not put any type of headphones in my ears. I'm just going to walk and I'm going to look at stuff around me. I'm going to allow for that to be a way to wind down from the day. You see what I'm saying? It's simple things that can help us to then allow for the dua to be transformational of the self, the prayer to be transformational of the self, right? And it doesn't have to take on those major stresses that are popping up in our head only, and then it becomes a little bit harder to move around. So let's pause here for today. We're going to pray Isha in probably 3 or 4 minutes, inshallah, if anybody wants to make wudu. I think most of you were here for when Hana was doing her halakha and she went over the programs that we're adding in the afternoons for people, I think, as well as some that are in the morning times. We'll be sending out information on that. But if you know people who are commuters, people who are here just during the day, you can tell them to jump in. We're going to be doing the rest of our events, halakha as normal for the rest of this week, inshallah. Is there anything that you're doing for Charity Week this week?
No, not that I know of yet, but I'll send out an email.
Like a volunteer info section or anything?
Yeah, we're gonna reach out to the volunteers that signed up, but if anybody wants to sign up, I can send out the volunteer interest form.
Yeah, and if you all are looking for things to get involved with, Charity Week is definitely an important thing to jump in on. You need to be helping people who are in need, stricken by poverty, orphans in specific. You want to get to a place where you're not just jumping into something because you feel like you have to, right? Because you want your motivation to be something that is rooted in real love. And part of this is going to be a practice that helps you to cultivate that love, right? The same way you can't benefit from prayer or dua other than if you're making dua and praying. You also are not going to then be able to cultivate the gain that comes from being in service of others if you're not doing the service of them. And so to prioritize those who literally don't have anyone, right? I've sat with orphans in different parts of this world, people who literally, like I've been in parts of the world where mothers, when they find out I'm from the United States, they try to give me their children. And they say, if you don't take my daughter, you don't take my son, I'm gonna either be dead in a week and then they will die because there's no one to look after them, or I'm gonna witness them die because we don't have food or basic medicines to give to my child, and that's gonna kill me, and I'm not gonna want to live after I see my baby die. We had a student here, mashallah, some years ago who I noticed wasn't eating so much. When I asked her, is everything okay? Is your family doing well financially? She said, yes, we're doing fine. And this is when our students were raising money for the people of Palestine. And I said, then why don't I see you eating all that much? And she said that you told us that there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says that food for one is enough for two, and food for two is enough for four. And I said, yes. And she said, these last few weeks, I've been eating all my meals with my brothers and sisters in Palestine. And that the money she was saving from not going out, from not eating at restaurants and just eating a banana and a bagel and whatever else, she was taking that and now putting it into the charity efforts that the students were engaged in. It's remarkable. It's also not about what am I giving up, it's about where someone else will have gain, right? And you want to be around people, like we said over here, who are also helping you to get to places that you should be aspiring to be, so that you're learning about charity by being charitable and being surrounded by people whose motivation is to be charitable. Does that make sense? So you want to sign up to be a part of it, definitely do whatever you can to help spread the word as they start pushing it out. Inshallah ta'ala, it'll be something that helps a lot of people. Okay, we'll pray Isha in a couple of minutes. And then for next week, uh, does Hanas end by 7? Yeah. We might also then start a little earlier if she's ending at 7, so that maybe we'll start at 7 as well, inshallah. Okay, I'll see you all then, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.